so long she nearly suffocated. She was to endure brain damage for the rest of her life from the lack of oxygen. Before leaving, the soldiers murdered the landlord's 2 children, aged 4 and 2. They beheaded the older child and split the head of the younger one with a sword. When it was safe to emerge, the 8-year-old survivor, who had been hiding under the blankets, crawled to the next room, where she lay beside the body of her mother. Together with her 4-year-old sister, they lived for 14 days on rice crusts that their mother had prepared before the siege. When a member of the International Committee arrived at the house weeks after the slaughter, he saw that one young girl had been raped on the table. While 6 weeks of horror 93 was there, he testified later the blood on the table left bracket was right bracket not all dry yet. A similar story, no less grisly, involves a 15-year-old Chinese girl whose family was murdered before her eyes. The Japanese first killed her brother, whom they wrongly accused of being a Chinese soldier, then her brother's wife and her older sister because they both resisted rape, and finally her mother and father, who knelt on the floor begging the Japanese to spare the lives of their children. Before they died under the thrusts of Japanese bayonets, their last words urged the young girl to do whatever the enemy soldiers wanted from her. The girl fainted. She revived to find herself naked on the floor, in a strange, locked room. Someone had raped her, while she had been unconscious. Her clothes had been taken from her, as they had been taken from other girls in the building. Her room was on the 2nd floor, of a building converted into barracks, for 200 Japanese soldiers. The women inside consisted of 2 groups. Prostitutes, who were given their freedom, and treated well, and respectable girls, who had been kidnapped into sexual slavery. Of the latter group, at least one girl attempted suicide. For a month and a half, the 15-year-old was raped 2 or 3 times a day. Eventually she became so diseased the Japanese left her alone. One day a kind Japanese officer, who spoke Chinese, approached her and asked why she was weeping. After hearing her story, he took her to Nanking by car, set her free inside the south gate, and wrote down the name of Jinling College for her on a piece of paper. The girl was too sick to walk to Jinling the first day, and took refuge in a Chinese house. Only on the 2nd day did she reach Jinling, where International Committee members immediately rushed her to the hospital. That girl was considered fortunate. Many other girls, tied naked to chairs, beds, or poles as permanent fixtures for rape, did not survive such treatment. Chinese witnesses described the body of an 11-year-old girl who died after she was raped continuously for 2 days. According to eyewitness reports, the blood-stained, swollen and ruptured area between the girl's legs created a disgusting scene difficult for anyone to look at directly. During the mass rape, the Japanese destroyed children and infants, often because they were in the way. Eyewitness reports describe children and babies suffocating from clothes stuffed in their mouths or beheaded to death because they wept as their mothers were being raped. American and European observers of the Rape of Nanking recorded numerous entries like this one. 415. February 3, about 5 p.m., at Changshujiang near Tachungqiao, 3 soldiers came and forced a woman to throw away her baby, and after raping her, they went away laughing. Countless men died trying to protect their loved ones from rape. When the Japanese dragged away one woman from a mat shed and her husband intervened, they stuck a wire through his nose and tied the other end of the wire to a tree just like one would tie up a bull. There they beheaded him repeatedly, despite the pleas of his mother, who rolled around on the ground crying hysterically. The Japanese ordered the mother to go into the house or they would kill her. The son died from the wounds on the spot. There seemed to be no limit to the Japanese capacity for human degradation and sexual perversion in Nanking. Just as some soldiers invented killing contests to break the monotony of murder, so did some invent games of recreational rape and torture when wearied by the glut of sex. Perhaps one of the most brutal forms of Japanese entertainment was the impalement of vaginas. In the streets of Nanking, corpses of women lay with their legs splayed open, their orifices pierced by wooden rods, twigs, and weeds. It is painful, almost mind-numbing, to contemplate some of the other objects that were used to torment the Nanking women, who suffered almost unendurable ordeals. For instance, one Japanese soldier, who raped a young woman, thrust a beer bottle into her, and shot her. Another rape victim was found with a golf stick rammed into her. And on December 22nd, in a neighborhood near the gate of Tongjiman, the Japanese raped a barber's wife and then stuck a firecracker in her vagina. It blew up and killed her. But not all of the victims were women. Chinese men were often sodomized or forced to perform a variety of repulsive sexual acts in front of laughing Japanese soldiers. At least one Chinese man was murdered because he refused to commit necrophilia with the corpse of a woman in the snow. The Japanese also delighted in trying to coerce men who had taken lifetime vows of celibacy to engage in sexual intercourse. A Chinese woman had tried to disguise herself as a man to pass through one of the gates of Nanking, but Japanese guards, who systematically searched all passing pedestrians by groping at their crotches, discovered her true sex. Gang rape followed, at which time a Buddhist monk had the misfortune to venture near the scene. The Japanese tried to force him to have sex with the woman they had just raped. When the monk protested, they castrated him, causing the poor man to bleed to death. Some of the most sordid instances of sexual torture involved the degradation of entire families. The Japanese drew sadistic pleasure in forcing Chinese men to commit incest, fathers to rape their own daughters, brothers their sisters, sons their mothers. Guoki, a Chinese battalion commander, stranded in Nanking for 3 months after the city fell, saw or heard of at least 4 or 5 instances in which the Japanese ordered sons to rape their mothers. Those who refused were killed on the spot. His report is substantiated by the testimony of a German diplomat who reported that one Chinese man who refused to rape his own mother was killed with saber strokes and that his mother committed suicide shortly afterwards. Some families openly embraced death rather than participate in their own destruction. One such family was crossing the Yangtze River when 2 Japanese soldiers stopped them and demanded an inspection. Upon seeing the young women and girls in the boat, the soldiers raped them right in front of their parents and husbands. This was horrifying enough, but what the soldiers demanded next of the family devastated them. The soldiers wanted the old man of the family to rape the women as well. Rather than obey, the entire family jumped into the river and drowned. Once women were caught by Japanese soldiers, there was little hope for them, for most were killed immediately after rape. But not all women submitted easily. Many were able to hide from the Japanese for months in fuel stacks, under piles of grass or straw, in pig pens, on boats, in deserted houses. In the countryside, women hid in covered holes in the earth, holes that Japanese soldiers tried to discover by stamping on the ground. One Buddhist nun and a little girl avoided rape and murder because they lay still in a ditch filled with bodies and feigned death for 5 days. Women eluded rape using a variety of methods. Some used disguising soot on their faces to appear old and diseased, or shaving their heads to pass themselves off as men. One clever young woman disguised herself as an old woman, hobbling about on a cane, and even borrowing a little boy of 6 to carry on her back until she safely entered the safety zone at Jinling College. Others feigned sickness, such as the woman who told Japanese soldiers she had given birth to a dead child 4 days before. Another woman took the advice of a Chinese captive to force her finger down her throat and vomit several times. Her Japanese captors hastily expelled her from the building. Some escaped by sheer quickness, ducking in and out of crowds, climbing over walls, with the Japanese in hot pursuit. One girl barely avoided assault by tripping up a Japanese soldier on the 3rd floor of a house and sliding down a bamboo pole that a Chinese man propped up for her from the garden. Once caught women who struggled faced the possibility of torture as a warning to others who dared to resist the Japanese. Those who defied the Japanese were often found later with their eyes torn out, or their noses, ears, or breasts cut off. Few women dared fight their assailants, but there were scattered accounts of resistance. A school teacher gunned down 5 Japanese soldiers before being shot to death. The most famous story, 6 Weeks of Horror 97, involves Li Zoying, a woman who not only suffered 37 bayonet wounds during her struggle against the Japanese but survived and remained robust enough to narrate and play act the story almost 60 years later. In 1937, 18-year-old Li Zoying was the bride of a military technician. When the government evacuated the capital, her husband left Nanking on the top of a train packed with Chinese soldiers. Lee stayed behind because she was 6 to 7 months pregnant and believed it was dangerous, in her condition, to board a crowded train. Like many other Chinese civilians in Nanking, Lee and her father fled into the foreign-run safety zone. They hid in the basement of an elementary school that had been converted into a refugee camp. But this camp, like others in the zone, was subject to repeated Japanese inspections and invasions. On December 18, a group of Japanese soldiers broke in and dragged the young men out of the school. The following morning, they returned for the women. Fearful of what the Japanese would do to a pregnant housewife, Lee made an impulsive decision. She tried to kill herself by slamming her head against the basement wall. When she regained consciousness, she found herself lying on a small canvas cot on the floor of the basement. The Japanese were gone, but they had taken several young women with them. Wild thoughts raced through Lee's head while she lay in a daze on the cot. If she ran out of the building, she might be throwing herself at Japanese rapists. But if she did nothing and waited, they would probably come back for her. Lee decided to stay. If the Japanese did not return, all would be well and good, but if they did, she would fight them to the death. She would rather die, she told herself, than be raped by the Japanese. Soon she heard the heavy footsteps of 3 Japanese soldiers coming down the stairs. 2 of them seized a couple of women and dragged them screaming out of the room. The one who remained eyed Lee intently as she lay immobile on the cot. Someone told him Lee was sick, and he responded by kicking all the other people out of the room, into the corridor. Slowly the soldier walked back and forth appraising her. Suddenly, before he quite realized what was happening, she made her move. She jumped from the cot, snatched his bayonet from his belt, and flung her back against the wall. He panicked, Lee recalled. He never thought a woman would fight back. He seized her wrist that held the bayonet, but Lee clutched his collar with her free hand and bit his arms with all her might. Even though the soldier wore full battle gear, and Lee wore only a cotton chapow, which impeded movement, she put up a good fight. The 2 of them grappled and kicked until the soldier found himself overwhelmed and screamed for help. The other soldiers ran in, no doubt incredulous at what they saw. They lunged toward her with their bayonets but failed to stab her effectively because their comrade was in the way. Because her opponent was so short and small, Lee was able to jerk him completely off his feet and use him like a shield to parry their thrusts. But then the soldiers aimed their bayonets at her head, slashing her face with their blades and knocking out her teeth. Her mouth filled with blood, which she spit into their eyes. Blood was on the walls, on the bed, on the floor, everywhere. Lee remembered. I had no fear in my mind. I was furious. My only thought was to fight and kill them. Finally a soldier plunged his bayonet into her belly, and everything went black for her. The soldiers left her for dead. When Lee's body was brought before her father, he could not sense any breath coming from her, and assumed the worst. He asked someone to carry her behind the school, and to dig a pit for her grave. Fortunately someone noticed before the burial that Lee was still breathing, and that bubbles of blood foamed from her mouth. Friends immediately rushed Lee to Nanking University Hospital, where doctors stitched up her 37 bayonet wounds. While unconscious, she miscarried that evening. Word of Lee's fight somehow reached her husband, who immediately asked the military for 3 months' leave and borrowed money to get back to Nanking. In August 1938, he returned and found his wife with her face swollen and crossed 6 weeks of horror. 99, hatched with scars and her newly shorn hair growing from her head like bristles. Lee would suffer both pain and embarrassment from her wounds for the rest of her life. Mucus leaked from a gaping hole on the side of her nose, and tears ran down her eyes during bad weather or bouts of illness. Miraculously, although the Japanese had stabbed the whites of her eyes with their bayonets, Lee did not go blind. Every time she looked in a mirror, she saw the scars that reminded her of that terrible day, December 1937. Now, after 58 years, the wrinkles have covered the scars, she told me during my visit to her apartment in Nanking. But when I was young, the scars on my face were obvious and terrible. Lee believes it was the combination of her personality and unique family background that gave her the will to fight back. Unlike other Chinese women, typically taught at an early age to be submissive, she came from a family completely devoid of feminine influence. Her mother died when she was only 13, forcing Lee to grow up among men, in a tough military family. Her father, brother, and uncles were either soldiers or policemen, and under their influence she became a tomboy. As a young girl, she also possessed a temper so short that her father dared not teach her kung fu, no doubt out of fear that she would terrorize the other kids on the block. Almost 60 years later, surrounded by her numerous children and grandchildren, Lee had retained her health and passion for life, even her reputation for being ill-tempered. Her one regret, she said, was not learning kung fu from her father. Otherwise she might have enjoyed the pleasure of killing all 3 of the Japanese soldiers that day. The death toll: how many people died during the Rape of Nanking? When minor Cyril Bates, a history professor at Nanking University, was asked during the International Military Tribunal of the Far East IMF to give an estimate of the deaths, he answered, "The question is so big, I don't know where to begin. The total spread of this killing was so extensive that no one can give a complete picture of it." The Chinese military specialist Liu Fangchu proposed the figure of 430,000. Officials at the Memorial Hall of the Victims of the Nanking Massacre by Japanese invaders and the procurator of the District Court of Nanking in 1946 claimed at least 300,000 were killed. The IMF judges concluded that more than 260,000 people were killed in Nanking. Fujiwara Akira, a Japanese historian, gives the figure of approximately 200,000. John Rabe, who never conducted a systematic count and left Nanking in February, before the slaughter ended, estimated that only 60,000 were killed. The Japanese author Haruki Hiko claims that the number was between 38,000 and 42,000. Still others in Japan place the number as low as 3,000. In 1994, archival evidence emerged from a former Japanese-owned railway company in Manchuria to reveal that one burial squad alone disposed of more than 30,000 bodies in Nanking. Between January and March 1938, perhaps no one has made a more thorough study of the statistics than Sun Jae-woo, a historian at the Jiangsu Academy of Social Sciences. In a 1990 scholarly paper entitled The Nanking Massacre and the Nanking Population, he reports that, according to census reports, the population in Nanking, in 1937, exceeded 1 million before hostilities broke out between Japan and China. Using Chinese archival material, memoirs from Chinese military officials, and reports of the Nanking branch of the Red Cross, Sun determined that at the time of Japanese occupation, there were at least 500,000 long-term residents in the city. The rest had already left the city, plus 90,000 Chinese soldiers, and tens of thousands of migrants, a total of approximately 600,000 people in Nanking, perhaps even 700,000. Sun gives his estimate in a second paper, The Nanking City Archives and the No. 2 National Archives of China, contain burial records submitted by private families, local charitable organizations, and the Nanjing Zhihuayuanhui, the Chinese puppet government, under the Japanese. After carefully examined 6 weeks of horror-eyeing these records, Sun found that charitable organizations in Nanking buried at least 185,000 bodies, private individuals at least 35,000, and the Japanese-controlled local government more than 7,400. Some of the burial records are so detailed they include categories for even the sex of the victims and the location of the disposal. Using Chinese burial records alone, Sun calculated that the number of dead from the Rape of Nanking exceeded the figure of 227,400. However, this statistic balloons still larger if one factors in a stunning confession made by a Japanese prisoner almost 4 decades before Sun's paper was written. In 1954, while awaiting trial at the Fukusuan War Criminal Camp in the northeastern province of Liaoning, Otohisao, a Japanese Imperial Army major, submitted a 44-page report in which he confessed that the Japanese army burned, dumped, or buried bodies in a massive disposal effort. Most of the bodies came from Xiaquan, the area near the river northwest of Nanking. On the waterfront, the Japanese piled 50 bodies onto each waiting boat, then took them to the middle of the river to dump overboard. Trucks carried bodies to other areas where they were burned and buried to eliminate evidence of the massacre. For 3 days, starting on December 15, 1937, Otta's army unit dumped 19,000 bodies of Chinese victims into the Nanking River, while a neighboring unit disposed of 81,000 bodies and other units got rid of 50,000. A total of some 150,000 bodies. By adding Otta's figure to his tally of Chinese burial record statistics, Sun concluded that the total number of corpses amounted to a staggering 377,400, a figure that surpasses the death toll for the atomic blasts at Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. Even if skeptics dismiss Otta's confession as a lie, one should keep in mind that even without his testimony, the burial records at Nanking offer convincing evidence that the death toll of the massacre was, at the very least, in the 200,000 range. Sun's research is corroborated by court exhibits that I unearthed from IMF records, see Table 4.1. By adding together the burial estimates of charitable organizations later mentioned in Sun's paper and the body counts made by other individuals not mentioned in Sun's paper, the tribunal concluded that approximately 260,000 people were killed during the Nanking Massacre. It is important to remember that the IMF number does not include Japanese burial statistics of the Chinese dead, which could push the figure into the 300,000 or even 400,000 range. Estimated number of victims of Japanese massacre in Nanking Shan-Tang, 112,266. Red Swastika Society, 43,071. Xiaquan District Sick, 26,100. Stated by Mr. Lu Su, 57,400. Stated by Messrs. Jui Chang and Young, 7,000 or more. Stated by Mr. Wu, 2,000 or more. Stated on the Tomb of the Unknown Victims, 3,000 or more. Total approximately 260,000. Source Document No. 1702, Box 134, IMF Records, Court Exhibits, 1948, World War II War Crimes Records Collection, Entry 14, Record Group 238, National Archives. In recent years, other scholars have bolstered Sun's study and given credence to the argument that the death toll at Nanking may have surpassed 300,000 people. For instance, in his paper Let the Whole World Know the Nanking Massacre, Wu Tianwei, professor emeritus of history at Southern Illinois University, estimates that the population of the city before its fall was approximately 630,000 people, a figure he concedes is far from exact but may be relatively close to the actual figure. After providing a detailed historiography of the body count research and examining the numbers carefully, he concludes that the death toll of the massacre exceeded 300,000 people, probably 6 weeks of horror. 340,000 people, of which 190,000 were killed collectively and 150,000 individually. The authors James Yuen and Shi Young obtained a number on the same scale, approximately 355,000, after conducting their own investigation. Although their figure already represents the high end of the spectrum of death toll estimates, Yuen and Young believe that the actual number of people killed in Nanking far exceeds the number they have been able to unearth from the records. They dismiss arguments from other experts who believe that considerable overlap may exist between death statistics and who suggest, for instance, that many of the bodies the Japanese dumped in the river were washed on shore, reburied, and tallied twice in the body count. Any corpse that washed up on land, they contend, would have been buried next to the river rather than in some remote location far from the river, but according to their research, most of the burial grounds were miles away from the banks of the Yangtze. It defies common sense, they argue, that the corpses, in advanced stages of decay from exposure, would be transported up hills or mountains, or across fields for burial. Moreover, Yuen and Young discovered through interviews with survivors that family members of rape and murder victims usually buried their dead immediately and neglected to report the burials to the authorities. Since their study tabulates numbers only from the reports of mass killings rather than individual, random murders, Yuen and Young believe that the total number of deaths from the Nanking Massacre lies well in the 400,000 range. There is even compelling evidence that the Japanese themselves believed, at the time of the massacre, that the death toll at Nanking may have been as high as 300,000. The evidence is significant because not only was it generated by the Japanese themselves, but it was done so during the first month of the massacre, when the killing was far from over. On January 17, 1938, Foreign Minister Hiroto Kiki in Tokyo relayed the following message to his contacts in Washington, D.C., a message that American intelligence intercepted, deciphered, and later translated into English on February 1, 1938 (parentheses in the original). Since return to Shanghai, a few days ago I investigated reported atrocities committed by Japanese Army in Nanking and elsewhere. Verbal accounts of reliable eyewitnesses, and letters from individuals, whose credibility is, beyond question, afford convincing proof that Japanese Army behaved and is continuing to behave in a fashion reminiscent of Attila and his Huns. Not less than 300,000 Chinese civilians slaughtered, many cases in cold blood. It is tempting to suggest that if Chiang Kai-shek had pulled out his armies during the mass government evacuation from Nanking in November and left behind a defenseless city, perhaps wholesale massacre could have been averted. But a minute's thought shows the weakness in that argument. The Japanese, after all, had spent the preceding few months systematically destroying entire villages and cities on their warpath to Nanking, and committing similar atrocities elsewhere. Clearly they needed no provocation from the Chinese for their actions. All we can say for certain is that a city devoid of Chinese soldiers would have at the very least taken away the Japanese excuse that serial executions were necessary to eliminate the soldiers hiding among the civilian population. But there is no evidence to suggest that it would have changed their actions. It is also tempting to suggest that if Chiang had refrained from ordering a senseless last-minute withdrawal from Nanking and had instead fought to the last man to save the city's fate would have been different. But here again we must be careful. Head-to-head combat would certainly not have worked. The Japanese were much better armed and trained, and would surely have overcome the Chinese forces sooner or later. But a lengthy, drawn-out struggle using guerrilla-style tactics might have demoralized the Japanese and elevated the Chinese. If nothing else, many more Japanese soldiers would have died fighting the Chinese, and their arrogance toward the Chinese soldier would have been muted by a fierce resistance. 5J the N1ANKINC Safety 0 NIN. The history of every war, there are always a few rare individuals who emerge as beacons of hope for the persecuted. In the United States, the Quakers freed their own slaves and helped establish the Underground Railroad. In Europe during World War II, Oskar Schindler, a Nazi, expended his fortune to save 1,200 Jews from the Auschwitz gas chambers, and Raoul Wallenberg, a Swedish diplomat, saved more than 100,000 Jews by giving them false passports. Who can forget Miepges, the Austrian woman, who together with others, hid the young Anne Frank and her family in an Amsterdam attic? Dark times paralyze most people, but some very few, for reasons most of us will never understand, are able to set aside all caution and do things even they could not imagine themselves doing in ordinary times. It is hard to talk about a bright spot in the horror that is the Rape of Nanking, but if one can, it is surely to shine a light on the actions of a small band of Americans and Europeans who risked their lives to defy the Japanese invaders and rescue hundreds of thousands of Chinese refugees from almost certain extermination. These courageous men and women created the International Committee for the Nanking Safety Zone. This is their story. The decision to create a safety zone in the city of Nanking arose almost spontaneously within weeks of the collapse of Shanghai. In November 1937, Father Jacquinot de Bessage, a French priest, established a neutral area in Shanghai to shelter 450,000 Chinese refugees whose homes had been destroyed by the invading Japanese soldiers. When the Presbyterian missionary W. Plumer Mills learned of Bessage's project, he suggested to his friends that a similar zone be created in Nanking. Mills and some 24 other people, mostly American, but also German, Danish, Russian, and Chinese, ultimately designated a region slightly west of the center of the city as a safety zone. Within the zone were situated Nanking University, Jinling Women's Arts and Science College, the American Embassy, and various Chinese government buildings. In setting up the zone, the committee sought to offer refuge for non-combatants caught in the crossfire between the Japanese and Chinese militaries. The foreigners had every intention of shutting the zone down a few days or weeks after the city passed safely into Japanese hands. The idea was not universally accepted at first. The Japanese, for one, flatly refused to honor it. And as enemy troops approached the city, the zone committee heard urgent pleas, not only from friends and family, but from Chinese, Japanese, and Western officials to abandon the project at once and flee for their lives. In early December, the American embassy staff insisted that the zone leaders join them on board the USS Panay, a gunboat packed with diplomats, journalists, and Western and Chinese refugees, as it prepared to move upriver away from Nanking. But the zone leaders politely declined the offer, and after giving them a final warning, the diplomats on the Panay, the Nanking Safety Zone 107, sailed away on December 9, 1937, leaving the remaining foreigners to their fate. Interestingly enough, the Panay would later be bombed and machine-gunned by Japanese aviators. On the afternoon of December 12, Japanese aviators sank the gunboat without warning, killing 2 people and wounding numerous others, even circling over the area repeatedly as if they planned to exterminate the survivors, who hid under a thicket of riverbank. Reads, the reasons for the attack were unclear. The Japanese later claimed that their aviators lost their cool judgment in the heat of battle and that fog or smoke prevented them from seeing the American flags on the Panay, but this claim was later proven to be demonstrably false. Not only was the day of the bombing sunny and cloudless, but the Japanese aviators had received explicit orders to bomb the Panay. Orders the aviators carried out reluctantly only after vehement protests and arguments. Today some suspect that the bombing was a test to see how the Americans would react, while others believe it was the result of internal politics within the Japanese high command. But whatever the reason behind the attack, the city of Nanking turned out to be a safer place for the remaining foreigners than the Panay. The first refugees to enter the Nanking safety zone were those who had lost their homes to aerial bombardments, or had abandoned homes on the outskirts of the city in the face of the approaching Japanese army. Soon these first refugees packed the camps so densely that it was said that many had to stand without sleeping for several days until new camps were added. Once the city fell, the zone housed not just thousands, but hundreds of thousands of people. For the next 6 weeks the committee had to find a way to provide these refugees with the bare necessities of survival: food, shelter, and medical care. The committee members also had to protect them from physical harm. Often this required on-the-spot intervention to prevent the Japanese military from proceeding with some threatened action. And through it all, though no one asked them to do so, they documented and broadcasted Japanese outrages to the world. In doing so they left a written record for posterity of what they had witnessed. In retrospect, it seems almost miraculous that some 24 foreigners managed to do everything they did while 50,000 Japanese soldiers ripped apart the city. Remember, by occupation these men and women were missionaries, doctors, professors, and executives, not seasoned military officers. Their lifestyles had been sheltered and leisurely. We were not rich, one woman said of that period, but a little foreign money went a long way in China. Many were ensconced in luxurious mansions, surrounded by teams of servants. Strangely, because of an incident in Nanking a decade earlier, most expected to have more trouble with the Chinese than the Japanese. Those who had been in Nanking in 1927 remembered that during the nationalist invasion of the city, Chinese troops recklessly killed foreigners and besieged a group of them, including the American consul and his wife, in a house on top of Sakani Hill. Would they kill us? One woman wrote of that horrible time. Would they torture us, as in the Boxer? Would they do worse, torture the children before our eyes? I did not let my mind touch what they might do to us as women. Indeed, one of the foreign eyewitnesses of the 1937 massacre admitted, we were more prepared for excesses from the fleeing Chinese, but never from the Japanese. On the contrary, we had expected that with the appearance of the Japanese the return of peace, quiet, and prosperity would occur. The heroic efforts of the Americans and Europeans during this period are so numerous, their diaries run for thousands of pages, that it is impossible to narrate all of their deeds here. For this reason, I have decided to concentrate on the activities of three individuals: a German businessman, an American surgeon, and an American missionary professor, before describing the committee's achievements as a whole. On the surface, the three could not have been more different. The Nanking Safety Zone 109, the Nazi who saved Nanking, perhaps the most fascinating character to emerge from the history of the Rape of Nanking, is the German businessman John Rabe. To most of the Chinese in the city, he was a hero, the living Buddha of Nanking, the legendary head of the International Safety Zone, who saved hundreds of thousands of Chinese lives. But to the Japanese, Rabe was a strange and unlikely savior. For he was not only a German national, a citizen of a country allied with Japan, but the leader of the Nazi Party in Nanking. In 1996, I began an investigation into the life of John Rabe, and eventually unearthed thousands of pages of diaries that he and other Nazis kept during the rape. These diaries led me to conclude that John Rabe was the Oskar Schindler of China. Prior to the rape, Rabe had led a relatively peaceful, though well-traveled life. The son of a sea captain, he was born in Hamburg, Germany, on November 23, 1882. After completing his apprenticeship in Flamberg, he worked a few years in Africa and then in 1908 moved to China, where he found employment at the Peking office of the Siemens China Company. In 1931, he transferred to the Nanking office, selling telephones and electrical equipment to the Chinese government. Bald and bespectacled, dressed in conservative suits and bow ties, he looked like a typical, middle-aged Western businessman in the city. Soon he became a pillar of the German community in Nanking, administering his own German school for elementary and junior high school students. As the years went by, Rabe became a staunch supporter of Nazism and the representative town leader for the Nazi Party in Nanking. In 1938, he would tell German audiences that I believe not only in the correctness of our political system, but as an organizer of the party, I am behind the system, 100%. Decades later, his granddaughter, Ursula Reinhardt, insists that Rabe saw the Nazi Party primarily as a socialist organization and did not support the persecution of Jews and other ethnic groups in Germany. This may well be true. During his visits to various ministries in Nanking, Rabe repeatedly summed up his Nazi philosophy in socialist terms. We are soldiers of work, we are a government of workers, we are friends to the worker, we will never leave the worker's side in times of crisis. When most of his fellow German nationals, on the advice of friends and embassy officials, departed China long before the Japanese military reached the gates of the city, Rabe chose to stay and was soon elected the head of the safety zone. In fact, even when Japanese embassy officials met with him and suggested more strongly that he leave, he remained. Dispatched by his superiors to protect Rabe during the fall of Nanking, Japan, as Major Oka asked him, "Why in the devil did you stay? Why do you want to involve yourself in our military affairs? What does all this matter to you? You haven't lost anything here." Rabe paused for a moment, then gave Oka his answer. "I have been living here in China for over 30 years, Rabe said. My kids and grandchildren were born here, and one am happy and successful here. I have always been treated well by the Chinese people, even during the war. If I had spent 30 years in Japan and were treated just as well by the Japanese people, you can be assured that, in a time of emergency, such as the situation China faces now, I would not leave the side of the people in Japan." This answer satisfied the Japanese major, who respected the concept of loyalty. He took a step back, mumbled some words about samurai obligations, and bowed deeply. Rabe wrote of the incident. But Rabe had an even more personal reason not to walk away and protect himself. He felt responsible for the safety of his Chinese employees, a team of Siemens mechanics who maintained the turbines in the city's main power plant, the telephones and clocks in every ministry, the alarms in the police stations, and the banks, and an enormous X-ray machine at the central hospital. What one only had a premonition of then, Rabe wrote, but what I now know is that all of them would have been killed or severely injured if I had left their side. The Nanking Safety Zone. Earlier that year, Rabe had endured countless air raids in Nanking with scarcely more than a foxhole and a few planks of wood for protection. Clothing was also scarce, especially after Rabe made the mistake, around late September, of storing his entire wardrobe on the Kutwo, a ship used to transport German nationals out of Nanking for safekeeping. Upon its arrival at Hankow, the Kutwo dumped its unclaimed luggage, leaving Rabe with only 2 suits, one of which he gave to a Chinese refugee, who he believed needed it more than he did. But his biggest concern was not for his own personal safety or well-being, but for the establishment of the safety zone. The committee members wanted the zone to be free of all military activity, but the Japanese army refused to recognize it as neutral territory, and the committee found it next to impossible to dislodge Chinese General Tang Shangqi's men from the area, especially because Tang's own villa stood within it. For Rabe, the final straw came when the Chinese army not only refused to evacuate the area, but erected its gun turrets on streets inside the zone. Losing his patience, Rabe threatened to quit his position as head of the safety zone and tell the world the reason why, unless Tang evacuated his troops from the area immediately. They promised me that my wishes would be respected, Rabe said, but the fulfillment itself took a bit longer. Rabe sensed the need to call on higher authorities for help. On November 25, he wired Adolf Hitler to request the Führer's kindly intercession in asking that the Japanese government grant the building of a neutral zone for those who are not fighting to battle for Nanking. At the same time, Rabe also sent a telegram to his friend General Counsel Mr. Kriebel, asking cordially for support of my request of the Führer, which otherwise would make a terrible bloodbath unavoidable. Heil Hitler. Rabe, Siemens representative and head of the International Committee in Nanking. Neither Hitler nor Kriebel replied, but Rabe soon noticed something unusual in the Japanese bombing pattern in the city. Before he sent the telegrams, Japanese planes bombed areas within Nanking indiscriminately. Afterwards, they attacked only military targets, such as military schools, airstrips, and arsenals. Wrote Rabe, this was the goal of my telegram, and it made quite a lasting impression on my American colleagues. But his triumph was short-lived, as one crisis loomed after another. Originally, Rabe and his colleagues hoped to reserve the empty buildings in the zone for the poorest citizens of Nanking. To avoid a rush of people, the committee had pasted posters all over the city, urging refugees to rent housing from friends. But so many people surged into the area of 2.5 square miles that Rabe soon found himself with 50,000 more residents than he had expected, even in the worst-case scenario. The refugees not only packed the buildings, but spilled forth onto lawns, trenches, and bomb dugouts. Entire families slept in the open streets, while hundreds of mat dwellings mushroomed next to the American embassy. By the time the city fell, the safety zone, its borders, lined by white flags and sheets marked with the Red Cross symbol within a red circle, was a swarming human beehive of 250,000 refugees. Sanitation soon posed another nightmare. The filth in the camps, especially the toilets, enraged Rabe, and it took a tirade on his part to get the refugee center on the Siemens grounds in acceptable order. Afterwards, when Rabe inspected the Siemens camp, he found not only were the toilets in better shape, but every wall on the Siemens grounds had been repaired. Nobody would tell me where the beautiful new bricks came from, Rabe wrote. I determined later on that many of the newer buildings in the area were considerably shorter than before. But the shortage of food created the worst headache of all for the zone leaders. In early December, the mayor of Nanking gave the International Committee 30,010 or 2,000 tons of rice and 10,000 bags of flour to feed the population. But the food was stored outside of the city and the Nanking Safety Zone 113. The committee lacked the necessary trucks to bring it into the zone. The Chinese military had already commandeered most of the vehicles in the area to transport 20,000 men and 5,000 cases of Peking Palace treasures out of the capital. Desperate civilians and individual soldiers had stolen virtually all the rest. With no alternative open to them, Rabe and the remaining foreigners drove frantically through Nanking, using their own automobiles to haul as much rice as possible into the zone. As the Japanese bombarded the city, the foreigners continued the deliveries. One driver actually lost an eye from flying shrapnel. In the end, the zone leaders secured only a fraction of the total food available, 10,000 tan of rice and 1,000 bags of flour, but the food went far to stave off hunger for many of the refugees in the zone. On December 9th, recognizing the dire situation ahead, the committee tried to negotiate a 3-day ceasefire, see Chapter 3, during which the Japanese could keep their positions, and the Chinese could withdraw peacefully from the walled city. However, Chiang Kai-shek did not agree to the ceasefire, prompting the Japanese to begin a furious bombardment of Nanking the following day. On December 12th, the committee was again approached by the Chinese military, this time to negotiate a surrender, but again the plan fell through. From that point on, there was little Rabe could do that day but watch and wait for the inevitable. He recorded the events as they unfolded, hour by hour. At 6:30 p.m. on December 12th, he wrote, "The cannons on the Purple Mountain fire continuously, there is lightning and thunder all around it. Suddenly the entire mountain is in flames, some houses and munitions depots are also on fire." At that moment Rabe recalled an instant Chinese saying that portended the city's doom. "When the Purple Mountain bums, then Nanking is lost." At 8 p.m., Rabe watched as the skies to the south of the city glowed red with flames. Then he heard frantic knocking on both gates of his house. Chinese women and children were begging for entrance. Men were scaling the garden wall behind. 114. The Rape of Nanking, his German school, and people were cramming themselves into the foxholes in his garden, even ducking under the giant German flag he had used to warn pilots from bombing his property. The cries and knocking increased until Rabe could bear it no longer. He flung open the gates to let the crowd in, but the noise only intensified as the night wore on. Exasperated, Rabe donned a steel helmet and ran through his garden, yelling at everyone to shut up. At 11:30 p.m., Rabe received a surprise visitor. It was Christian Kruger, a fellow Nazi Party member in his mid-30s who worked for the German engineering firm of Karlowitz & Company. The tall blonde engineer had come to China to oversee the construction of a large steel mill, but found himself, like Rabe, in the midst of Nanking's insanity. The International Committee had appointed Kruger its treasurer. Kruger had stopped by to tell Rabe that Changshan Road was littered with weapons and supplies that the Chinese military had left behind during its retreat. Someone had even abandoned a bus offering it for sale for $20. "Do you think someone will take it?" Kruger asked. "But Christian, how can they?" Rabe said. "Nah, I ordered the man to come into my office in the morning." Finally, the din around his house began to diminish. The ex-housed Rabe, who had not had time even to change clothes for 2 days, lay back in bed, trying to relax as the society he knew and loved collapsed around him. He knew that the Ministry of Communication building was burning down, and that the city would fall any minute. Rabe reassured himself that things would only get better, not worse, from this point on. "You don't have to be scared of the Japanese," his Chinese colleagues had told him. "As soon as they have taken over the city, peace and order will prevail. The rail connections with Shanghai will be quickly rebuilt and the stores will return to their normal functions." Before he fell asleep, Rabe thought, "Thank God that the worst has been overcome." The Nanking Safety Zone 115. The next morning Rabe awoke to the sound of yet another air raid. Apparently not all of the Chinese army had been forced from of the city, he thought. It was only 5 a.m., so he lay down again. Like most people in the city, Rabe had become so jaded by air raids that the blasts no longer bothered him. Later that morning Rabe explored the city to check out the extent of the damage. In the streets lay numerous Chinese corpses, many of them civilians, who had been shot in the back. He watched a group of Japanese soldiers push their way into a German coffee house. When Rabe chastised them for stealing, pointing to the German flags on the house, an English-speaking Japanese soldier snapped, "We are hungry. If you want to complain, go to the Japanese embassy. They will pay for it." The Japanese soldiers also told Rabe that their supply column had not arrived, and they could not count on the column for any nourishment, even if it did arrive. Later Rabe learned that the soldiers looted the coffee house, then set it afire. Worse was to come. In the distance, Rabe saw Japanese soldiers marching north from the south side of Nanking to occupy the rest of the city. To avoid them, he immediately drove north and reached the main street of the city, Chongshan Road, stopping at the Red Cross Hospital in the Foreign Ministry. The Chinese staff had fled the premises, and bodies were everywhere, clogging the rooms, corridors, and even the exits from the hospital. That day Rabe encountered the remains of the Chinese army, hungry and exhausted stragglers, who had failed to cross the Yangtze River to safety. Driving through Shanxi Road Circle, he met 400 Chinese troops, all of them still armed, marching in the direction of the advancing Japanese army. It was then that Rabe had a sudden humanitarian impulse that was to haunt his conscience for months, if not years, afterwards. Warning them about the Japanese troops to the south, Rabe advised the Chinese soldiers to throw away their machine guns and join the refugees in the safety zone. After a short discussion, they agreed and followed Rabe into the zone. Similarly, when hundreds of Chinese soldiers found themselves trapped on the northern side of the city, unable to secure passage across the river, many broke into the safety zone, begging the American and European administrators to save their lives. The committee members were uncertain as to whether they should help them. After all, they had created the zone as a sanctuary for civilians, not soldiers. The committee tried to solve the dilemma by addressing the issue with Japanese Army headquarters, but got no further than a captain on Hancheng Road. Moved by the plight of the soldiers, the committee eventually caved into their pleas. Like Rabe, they told the soldiers that if they laid down their arms, the Japanese might treat them mercifully. Then they helped the soldiers disarm and housed them in various buildings within the neutral area. In the confusion, many of the soldiers stripped off their uniforms and mingled with the civilians in the zone. The next day John Rabe wrote a long letter explaining the situation to a Japanese military commander. He begged the Japanese to exercise mercy toward the former soldiers and to treat them humanely according to the recognized laws of war. To Rabe's great relief, a Japanese officer promised him that the lives of the Chinese soldiers would be spared. But relief turned into horror when the Japanese betrayed Rabe and seized the disarmed soldiers for execution. If Rabe had hoped that the Japanese would not be able to separate the troops from the hundreds of thousands of civilians, he was sorely mistaken. The Japanese detected virtually every one of the former soldiers by examining their hands, knowing that the daily use of guns caused calluses on certain areas on the fingers of soldiers. They also examined shoulders for backpack marks, foreheads and hair for indentations from military caps, and even feet for blisters caused from months of marching. During a staff conference the night of December 14th, the committee learned that the Japanese had rounded up 1,300 men in a safety zone camp near the headquarters to shoot them. We knew that there were a number of ex-soldiers among them, but Rabe had been promised by an officer that afternoon that their lives would be spared. George Fitch, the Nanking Safety Zone 117 YMCA representative, wrote in his diary of the incident. It was now all too obvious what they were going to do. The men were lined up and roped together in groups of about 100 by soldiers, with bayonets fixed. Those who had hats had them roughly torn off and thrown to the ground, and then by the lights of our headlights, we watched them marched away to their doom. Did I have the right to act that way? Rabe wrote later of his decision to quarter the soldiers in the zone. Did I handle that correctly? For the next few days, Rabe watched helplessly as the Japanese dragged thousands more soldiers from the zone and executed them. Japanese killed thousands of innocent men who happened to have calluses on their fingers, foreheads, or feet, men who were rickshaw coolies, manual laborers, and police officers. Rabe later witnessed the Red Swastika Society, a charitable Buddhist organization in the city, pull more than 120 corpses from a single pond. In a later report, Rabe pointed out that several ponds in Nanking actually disappeared because they were so filled with corpses. As both head of the International Committee and local head of the Nazi Party, a position that was certain to carry some weight with the Japanese authorities, Rabe wrote letter after letter to the Japanese embassy. At first he was unfailingly polite, toning down his anger because of his perceived obligation as a German citizen and Nazi leader to maintain the relationship between the two embassies. He asked the American members of the committee to let him review their letters to the Japanese embassy so that he could put some honey into them as well. He maintained his polite tone in his personal visits to the embassy. In turn, the Japanese diplomats received Rabe's letters and visits with gracious smiles and official courtesy, but in the end he always received the same answer: "We shall inform the military authorities." As days passed, each bringing its own unrelenting onslaught of fresh atrocities, Rabe's written communication to the Japanese grew increasingly hostile, punctuated with exclamations of outrage. All 27 Westerners in the city at that time, and our Chinese population, were totally surprised by the reign of robbery, raping, and killing initiated by your soldiers. On the 14th, we did not find a single Japanese patrol, either in the zone or at the entrances. Yesterday, in broad daylight, several women at the seminary were raped right in the middle of a large room filled with men, women, and children. We 22 Westerners cannot feed 200,000 Chinese civilians and protect them night and day. That is the duty of the Japanese authorities. If you can give them protection, we can help feed them. If this process of terrorism continues, it will be next to impossible to locate workers to get the essential services started. Gradually, Rabe and the rest of the International Committee begin to read the real message. In the diplomat's answers, it was the military, not the embassy, calling the shots. Fukuda Tokuyasu, secretary of the Japanese embassy, told Rabe as much by saying, "The Japanese army wants to make it very bad for the town, but we, the embassy, will try to prevent it." During the Great Rape, some Japanese embassy officials actually suggested that the International Committee seek publicity in Japan directly so that public opinion would force the Japanese government to take action. But at the same time, another embassy official urged Rabe to remain silent, warning him that if you tell the newspaper reporters anything bad, you will have the entire Japanese army against you. Finally, with only his status as an official of an allied nation for protection, Rabe did what now seems the unthinkable. He began to roam about the city, trying to prevent atrocities himself. Whenever he drove through Nanking, some man would inevitably leap out and stop the car to beg Rabe to stop a rape in the Nanking Safety Zone 119 progress, a rape that usually involved a sister, a wife, or a daughter. Rabe would then let the man climb into the car and direct him to the scene of the rape. Once there, he would chase Japanese soldiers away from their prey, on one occasion even bodily lifting a soldier sprawled on top of a young girl. He knew these expeditions were highly dangerous. The Japanese had pistols and bayonets, and I had only party symbols and my swastika armband. Rabe wrote in his report to Hitler, but nothing could deter him from making them, not even the risk of death. His diary entry on January 1, 1938, is typical. The mother of a young attractive girl called out to me and, throwing herself on her knees, crying, said I should help her. Upon entering left bracket the house right bracket, I saw a Japanese soldier lying completely naked on a young girl who was crying hysterically. I yelled at this swine, in any language it would be understood, "Happy New Year!" And he fled from there, naked and with his pants in his hand. Rabe was appalled by the rape in the city. In the streets he passed scores of female corpses, raped and mutilated, next to the charred remains of their homes. Groups of 3 to 10 marauding soldiers would begin by traveling through the city and robbing whatever there was to steal, Rabe wrote in his report to Hitler. They would continue by raping the women and girls and killing anything and anyone that offered any resistance, attempted to run away from them, or simply happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. There were girls under the age of 8 and women over the age of 70 who were raped and then, in the most brutal way possible, knocked down and beat up. We found corpses of women on beer glasses and others who had been lanced by bamboo shoots. I saw the victims with my own eyes. I talked to some of them right before their deaths and had their bodies brought to the morgue at the Kulo Hospital so that I could be personally convinced that all of these reports had touched on the truth. As he walked through the burning wreckage of his beloved city, IABE could read on almost every street corner beautiful Japanese posters that proclaimed, "Trust our Japanese army, they will protect and feed you." Determined to save Chinese lives, Rabe sheltered as many people as he could, turning his house and office into sanctuaries for Siemens employees and their families. Rabe also harbored hundreds of Chinese women on his property, permitting them to live in tiny straw huts in his backyard. With these women, Rabe developed a warning system to protect them from Japanese rapists. Whenever Japanese soldiers scaled the wall of his yard, the women would blow a whistle and send Rabe running out into the yard to chase the offenders away. This happened so frequently that Rabe rarely left his home at night, fearful that Japanese intruders would commit an orgy of rape in his absence. He complained about the situation to Japanese military officers, but they failed to take the matter seriously. Even when Rabe caught a Japanese soldier raping a woman in one of the backyard straw huts, a military officer did nothing to punish the rapist except slap him across the face. If Rabe was frustrated by the futility